Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 28, The Breaking of the Wave. Last week was certainly something, wasn't it? Moving forward, just to give you an idea about how the next few weeks will look for our purposes, this is episode 28, and I plan on publishing 6 more episodes on the Korean War, with each taking on both a chronological history of the war, as well as further discussions of specific topics. We will end sometime in February with the 35th and final episode of the series, which will be a retrospective of the war and of the series itself. My first series of what I have now decided will be a continuing podcast. I'll have more information on the future of the podcast at a later date. We rejoin our history of the Korean War at the beginning of May 1951. The last month had seen both the dauntless and rugged operations from the United Nations, as well as the beginning of the 5th phase offensive from the Chinese and North Koreans. As April ambled to a close, that communist offensive fell into a lull, with the communist leadership forced into pulling back from the line of contact to reassess their situation. This lull was only momentary, however, as Peng Dehuai and his colleagues planned a quick resumption of the attack. And, they swore that this would be the final push necessary to force the imperialist scum out of Korea. Before then, though, they needed to rebuild their strength and give their men some time to rest. On the 30th of April, the commander of the U.S. 8th Army, James Van Fleet, sent out orders to build forward combat posts 5 or so miles north of the United Nations' main defensive line, that unnamed one called No Name Line. Those posts, along with extensive patrolling throughout the area where one would expect to find the enemy, revealed that no enemy was in fact present immediately north of the UN line. That absence of contact continued for the next week when, on May 9th, Van Fleet ordered a new advance to Line Kansas to begin on the 12th. The first step was for all UN forces to advance to lines Topeka and Missouri, which sat just a few miles north of the No Name Line in the west and east. But remember that the No Name Line angled up from Seoul towards the 38th parallel on the east coast. On the 12th, little contact was made in the early advance, and most units were able to reach their goals for the first day of this small counteroffensive. Rain made their advance slow across the peninsula, but limited contact further emboldened UN forces to go further. Captured communist soldiers and friendly civilians provided consistent reports that the communist offensive would soon resume, though. But where the offensive would pick up again was unclear, at least in the eyes of Van Fleet's staff. Prisoners consistently said in this limited window of information viability that the attack would come in the eastern half of the front. Van Fleet's staff thought that improbable, given the larger and generally better network of roads in the west. Also, Seoul was in the west, and wouldn't it make more sense for the communists to go for Seoul as they had been before? There was a greater logistical challenge to moving through the more mountainous east that just could not be worth anything gained, as the American line of thinking went. Despite those misgivings about the new intelligence, Van Fleet ordered some defensive preparations undertaken along a corridor south of the Hwachon Reservoir and south of the Soyang River, in the east. On May 16th, the communists put those defenses to the test. In attacking further east, People's Volunteer Army Commander Peng Dehuai wanted to limit the advantages of the UN forces. The rougher terrain of the Taebaek Mountains would limit the mobility of mechanized forces and would decrease the effectiveness of air cover and artillery support. Logistics would be an issue for communist forces, but less so for them than their enemy, given the communists' ability to recruit local civilians into their logistics network. This resumed operation was planned at the PVA's 9th Army headquarters on May 8th and 9th, with 9th Army Commander General Song Shi-lun ordering all available units eastward. As planned, the 5th phase offensive would resume on the evening of May 16th, with the 12th, 15th, and 27th Armies opening and expanding a gap between the Republic of Korea Army divisions in the east and the non-Korean UN units in the west. The attack would then circle around UN forces from the east and, eventually, corral UN forces to the west coast. From east to west in the offensive sector, the Korea People's Army 2nd and 5th Corps, PVA 20th, 27th, 12th, 15th, and 60th Armies lined up against the ROKA 11th, Capital, 3rd, 9th, 7th, and 5th Divisions, and the U.S. 2nd Infantry and 1st Marine Divisions. The numerical advantage the Communists held over their enemy was, as was often the case, quite large, estimated to be upwards of 100,000 more men. The attack began as scheduled and immediately found success. The PVA's 27th Army struck right at the joint between the ROKA 5th and 7th Divisions, prying them apart from each other and forcing them into disordered retreat. Those divisions collapsed into chaos, losing men, artillery, and vehicles in the scrum. Pak Sun-yup, commanding general of the ROKA 1st Corps, writes that the 5th and 7th Division had little chance against the crushing weight of the enemy advance that had enveloped them so quickly. The biggest issue was that those divisions collapsed without resistance, leaving valuable supplies and equipment behind that would allow the enemy to sustain themselves a bit longer. The collapse of the 5th and 7th Divisions opened the eastern flank of the 2nd Division to attack, forcing a shift in core sector lines 4 miles east, which allowed the 2nd Division to place more force in the penetration zone, shifted the 1st Marines to the east to man previous 2nd Division positions, and used units of the 9th Corps' 7th Division to hold the former Marine positions. The ROKA 1st and 3rd Corps along the eastern coast and in the Taebaek Mountains were also ordered to withdraw to Line Waco, around 15 miles or so south of the No-Name Line. Like the 5th and 7th Divisions, the 3rd Corps' 3rd and 9th Divisions also faced a crushing assault and collapsed just as quickly. American artillery and aircraft pounded suspected and confirmed Communist positions all through the day and night, when the weather cooperated, nearly exhausting the stock of artillery shells in some rear storage areas. The battles fought right here, in the middle of May, in the middle of Korea, were fought over miscellaneous numbered hilltops, nameless mountain passes, and otherwise unremarkable gullies. Success met disaster in equal hand, as for every successfully withdrawn United Nations soldier and vehicle, every marching Chinese and North Korean soldier, there was a tank disabled by a minefield, or a soldier lying face down in the mud. Losses were not high overall for UN forces, but some battalions were hit especially hard, especially those that found themselves along that gap in the line. For Communist forces, we can't be sure how high losses were, but they were certainly higher than the UN numbers. That's just how these things usually worked out, with Communist losses almost always estimated significantly higher than UN losses for each engagement. And this is something that has not been confirmed either by the North Korean or Chinese governments, because they just have nothing to gain from releasing accurate numbers. However, despite the massive numerical advantage the Communists held and their quick success, they could not exploit fast enough the gap they opened with the collapse of the 5th and 7th Divisions. That gap became a bulge as the eastern and western UN lines along the bulge hardened against the attack, with the vanguard running out of steam by the 19th of May as PVA and KPA units rotated out of the front line for fresher replacements. Those replacements were expected to restart the attack in and around the bulge, pushing for an encircling maneuver behind American lines in the center of the front. Part of the risk of opening a gap in an enemy's lines and creating a bulge into that line is the possibility for the enemy to pull out the old Uno reverse card and encircle those forces in the bulge. That's exactly what Matthew Ridgway wanted to do after flying over the front lines on May 19th. counteroffensive operation was thus quickly planned and set for the very next day, the 20th. UN forces would advance across the entire front to line Topeka, from which they would move towards the Iron Triangle, limiting the Communists' ability to reinforce those troops in the Bulge. Then, the Bulge would be sealed off. The furthest Communist soldiers had driven into the UN line was Sok-Sari, about 25 miles from where the opening shots were fired. That village was recaptured by the ROKA's partially reconstituted 3rd Division on the 21st, marking the high tide point of the 5th Phase offensive. Pack writes that, on the 21st, he flew over the front towards a small mountain airstrip for a strategy meeting with American commanders. He describes rounding the face of Taegwal-Yong, a great mountain standing watch over the coastal fringe, and experiencing a shattered serenity of billowing black smoke. That smoke came from bombing runs of the U.S. Air Force, undertaken to destroy the abandoned equipment of the ROKA 3rd Corps. The next day, Van Fleet took the necessary step of deactivating the 3rd Corps, splitting its 2 divisions between X-Corps and Pack's 1st Corps and giving X-Corps responsibility for the former ROKA Corps sector. Pack writes that this action was taken in a decidedly gruff manner, with Van Fleet informing Pack, ROKA Chief of Staff Chung Il-kwon, and ROKA Forward Command Director Lee Jun-sik of his decision while they stood at attention on the runway to greet him. The whole affair took just a minute of their time and abolished every ROKA command larger than a division, except for the 1st Corps, and even that was subordinated to the 8th Army. Every other ROKA division was shuffled into an American corps, and the ROKA headquarters was stripped of any meaningful authority. Not even Douglas MacArthur took such a drastic step. This was all due to a failure of command Van Fleet had cautioned against just a month ago, with the Corps commander unable to maintain the necessary strength of command after crippling losses and disordered retreats early in the resumed offensive. Ridgway agreed with Van Fleet that the ROKA commanders were just not up to snuff. He writes in his memoirs that Rhee's continuous assertions that there was a great pool of manpower ready and willing to join the fight if only they were properly equipped by the Americans was immensely frustrating. It's not that he had to call Rhee's bluff that frustrated him. It's that he had to do so multiple times, publicly, to get the American press off his back about the matter that frustrated him. Well, that and the relatively frequent failures of ROKA commanders in the field. The same day that the PVA and KPA were planning their next attack, Ridgway was, alongside Ambassador John Muccio and General Van Fleet, meeting with Rhee to discuss their main concern with the ROKA. He directly requested that Rhee stop his inane calls for more equipment, as it made the morale of his own fighting men worse, decreasing their ability to hold fast against the enemy. Seemingly, that request made it through to Rhee, and he backed down, for the time being. The divisions of I Corps north of Seoul reached line Topeka just 3 days after setting off from the no-name line. The X Corps advance was much more cautious, although they met about the same amount of resistance across their sector as the men of I Corps. The advance of both X Corps and Ninth Corps was an advance of task forces, with mixed units of armor and infantry shooting forward of the main line to reconnoiter and report. Often, these mixed units would encounter heavy fire, engage as best they could, sometimes push forward with their armored units to their objectives, often returning to the main line to report the situation. From there, advancing divisions would encounter little to no resistance, with communist units withdrawing between the earlier skirmish and the full advance. Over the next couple days, sporadic communist attacks were met with withering artillery fire, at least, and heavy air attack when the weather was amenable. The advance was, of course, no walk in the park, but it was certainly not the heaviest resistance the communists had put up against a UN advance. Multiple opportunities to capture large groups of communist troops consistently slipped through the fingers of UN command during these few days in May, as task forces would often chance upon the tail end of withdrawing columns, or put up enough of a fight to scare off further meaningful resistance. By the 28th, it was clear that the UN counteroffensive was not quick enough to entrap major units of the PVA and KPA. Don't get me wrong, between 20 and 30,000 communist soldiers were captured during this counteroffensive, but Ridgway and his commanders expected much more to be captured with a faster advance. The operation was by no means a failure, it was just not as much of a success as they had wanted. As May drew to a close, UN Command had not only restabilized its line, it had pushed it back towards the 38th parallel once again. From the Chinese perspective, the withdrawal in the last 2 weeks of May was a mess. PAC attributes this to a decision by PVA Command to attack both flanks in the Bulge area instead of focusing their strength against one. Equally as likely is that the PVA and KPA just did not have the supplies necessary to sustain any attack longer than a few days. The chain of command fell apart in the mountains of eastern Korea, with full divisions losing thousands of soldiers at a time. A full withdrawal was planned for the 23rd, but a UN attack began in the exact area of the withdrawal 12 hours before it was set to begin. The local units broke rank and ran, leaving equipment, material, and wounded comrades behind. Food and clean water were increasingly hard to come by for most that fled. Communications between units broke down, further hampering Peng's ability to exert command and control on the front lines. Early in June, Peng had to declare finished what had already been effectively over for a while. The Fifth Phase Offensive was the last great communist offensive to really scare the UN command during this mobile phase of the war. It ended like so many other grand offensives before it, during this war and others, with the men at the front ensconced in combat, let down by a lack of supplies and support. Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong had underestimated the very apparent strength of their enemy, and dangerously overestimated the skills of their own soldiers, and they were now staring down the barrel of a very different war, again. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the Chinese Fifth Phase Offensive well and truly over. Next episode, we will discuss the beginning of gridlock in Korea. There are maps of this episode's events on social media for those of you that are interested. As always, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. You can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.